Territory of Montana. November 1947. When Earl Hutchins dragged the sections of a nearly 60-foot steel arch along the frozen trail leading to his homestead, the men gathered outside the trading post stopped talking. First they watched him in silence. Then came the smirks. Then open laughter. The corrugated metal looked dull beneath the gray sky. It was a relic of war, a curved arch sold off as military surplus, meant to store heavy machinery, not to wrap around a log cabin like some unnatural second skin. No one in the valley had ever seen anything like it. Not because it was bold, but because it looked ridiculous. "That man's lost his mind," someone muttered. Earl didn't answer. He kept moving, gloves stiff with cold, white breath spilling out in slow clouds. He wasn't building a new house. He wasn't fixing the old one. He was trying something different, trying to protect it from an enemy everyone accepted as inevitable. The previous winter had been his cruelest teacher. In the summer of 1946, Earl had built a solid cabin by every known standard. 12-inch spruce logs. A fieldstone foundation. A steep roof so snow could slide off. To the neighbors, it was a respectable structure. To Earl, it had been an act of hope. But hope didn't keep you warm. The first winter came early and without mercy. Wind poured down from the mountains like an invisible saw, finding every crack, every joint, every human mistake. The fire burned constantly, and still, by morning, ice coated the inside of the walls. Earl got up every 3 hours to feed the stove. He burned through 4 cords of wood in January alone. Even then, the indoor temperature barely reached 45 degrees Fahrenheit. On the best nights, his daughters, Ruth and Clara, slept in their coats. His wife, Margaret, stuffed rags into the floor gaps every evening, only to find them stiff as boards by dawn. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't lack of effort. It was something deeper. It was physics. Earl knew that because he wasn't just a homesteader. Before buying those 160 acres of timber and stone, he had been an army engineer. He'd spent 2 years building barracks on permafrost, places where cold killed quickly and without ceremony. There, those same steel arches, cold to the touch, seemingly useless, held steady temperatures with a single stove. Not because metal insulated, but because the wind couldn't touch anything alive. That idea followed him through the spring. And when the military depot in Great Falls liquidated surplus equipment in October, Earl knew he'd found his chance. He paid $5 for the arch, hauled it home in pieces, and while the neighbors watched in disbelief, began assembling a structure that wasn't meant to be pretty or traditional, only functional. The plan was simple. Raise the arch over the existing cabin, leaving a 2-foot air gap on all sides. Stop the wind before it reached the logs. Create a dead zone, an invisible cushion where air couldn't move freely. He didn't call it thermal design. He called it necessity. By late October, the structure was standing. The curved ribs rose like metal bones around the cabin. From the outside, it looked as if a barn had swallowed a house. From the inside, the corridor between steel and wood was dark, silent, unsettling. Margaret looked at it one night and shook her head. "People are going to think we're crazy." Earl didn't look up from his hammer. "Let them think whatever they want. I just want our girls to stop shaking when they sleep." The mockery came quickly. At the trading post, some called him a coward. Others said the metal would sweat moisture, that the cabin would rot from the outside in. A trapper nicknamed it the metal coffin. Even Earl's own brother, a respected carpenter, told him it looked like desperation. "If this worked, someone would have done it already," he said before walking away. Earl heard everything. He didn't argue. He adjusted vents, sealed joints, reinforced the frame. He knew winter would be the final judge. And winter arrived like a verdict. December brought a cold that forgave nothing. Temperatures dropped so low that breath froze before it touched the ground. For weeks, the thermometer never climbed above 0. Families burned firewood like paper. Animals died standing up. Chimneys failed. Fear settled into every home. Then something strange began to draw attention. While other cabins belched constant smoke, Earl's showed only a thin wisp. While men ran frantically to their woodpiles, Earl split logs calmly, working in his shirt sleeves. No one understood. Not yet. because they hadn't crossed his doorway. And when they finally did, they would discover that while the world outside was freezing solid, inside that metal-wrapped cabin, winter had lost its power. The winter of 1947 did not arrive gently. It fell on the valley like a slab of stone, heavy, unforgiving, erasing any difference between optimism and foolishness. For more than 20 straight days, the thermometer refused to rise above zero. Nights plunged to levels the old-timers remembered only from stories, winters that had left unmarked graves along the roadsides. At the trading post, men spoke in hushed voices around the stove, counting cords of firewood like gold coins. No one was comfortable. No one slept well. In most cabins, warmth lasted an hour or two after feeding the fire. The rest of the day was endurance. Coats worn indoors. Gloves for cooking. Children shivering in silence. In that setting, Earl Hutchins's cabin became an uncomfortable rumor. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just a stray observation. Calvin Drecker, owner of the sawmill, passed by Earl's property early one morning. The cold cut skin like glass. Calvin hunched into his coat, cursing the wind, when he noticed something strange. Hutchins's chimney was barely releasing any smoke. It didn't make sense. In that kind of weather, a cabin needed constant fire just to remain livable. Calvin Drecker stopped. He watched for several seconds. Nothing. No frantic movement. No signs of desperation. On the contrary, Earl was outside splitting firewood with calm, steady motions, without the urgency of a man whose family was freezing inside. "He's got to be crazy," Calvin muttered, more to reassure himself than out of conviction. Over the next few days, others began to notice the same thing. While most woodpiles were shrinking at an alarming rate, Hutchins's stacks seemed to drop at an almost normal pace. No one wanted to be the first to admit that something didn't add up. The laughter continued, but it no longer sounded confident. The official explanation among the neighbors was simple. Earl was exaggerating. Maybe they all slept in one room. Maybe they were freezing and just not saying it. Maybe the metal was trapping moisture and the disaster simply hadn't revealed itself yet. That theory collapsed the day Calvin decided to knock on the door. It was December 23rd. Outside, the thermometer read -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Calvin had emergency firewood in his truck for a nearby family and thought Earl might need help too. Nobody survived that kind of cold without burning wood at a brutal pace. Margaret opened the door. Calvin felt the warm air hit him before he even crossed the threshold. It wasn't stifling heat. It was worse for his certainty. It was comfort. Behind Margaret, he saw the girls sitting at the table, dressed in light clothes, focused on their notebooks. No blankets over their shoulders. Not huddled near the stove. Just living. "Is everything all right?" Calvin asked, confused. "We're fine," Margaret replied naturally. "Do you need firewood?" Calvin didn't answer right away. He looked at the small pile of logs stacked along the inside wall. "That's all we'll need for a few more days," she added. "We're not burning much." Calvin stepped inside. With every step, he sank deeper into a reality he couldn't reconcile with everything he believed he knew about winter. He touched the log wall. It was cool but not frozen. It didn't radiate that vicious cold that seemed to pierce the skin in every other cabin in the valley. Earl appeared from the back of the cabin wearing a flannel shirt, his expression calm. "Calvin, how warm do you think it is in here?" he asked bluntly. Earl pointed to the thermometer hanging near the door. 63 right now. It was 68 this afternoon. Calvin stood frozen. 63 inside. -38 outside. A difference that defied everything he'd learned in 40 years of cutting timber and building cabins. "How?" he started but didn't finish the sentence. Earl didn't talk about brilliance or invention. He pointed to the dark corridor between the cabin and the steel arch. "The wind never touches the logs. The air out there doesn't move. The heat stays put." That was all. Calvin left in silence. That night at the trading post, he didn't laugh. He didn't explain much either. He only said one sentence that made several men look up. "It's warmer inside that cabin than anywhere else in the valley, and he's burning less wood." At first, no one wanted to believe it. But the cold didn't ease, and the woodpiles kept shrinking. Slowly, mockery turned into unease. Then into curiosity. By the end of December, people weren't talking about a metal coffin anymore. They were talking about the place where winter didn't rule. And everyone knew that sooner or later, they'd have to see it with their own eyes. January 1st, 1948, dawned without celebration. There were no toasts, no laughter in the valley. The cold had drained everyone's spirit. At 40 below, the new year wasn't welcomed. It was endured. Men stepped out of their homes with hardened faces, eyebrows crusted with ice, thinking about one thing only: how much longer they could keep burning wood at the rate they were going. That same day, someone decided rumors were no longer enough. The county extension agent, Mr. Pollard, arrived at Earl Hutchins's property with a leather briefcase and a rigid expression. He hadn't come to admire or to mock. He had come to measure. Pollard was a man of numbers and reports, someone who trusted nothing he couldn't verify with calibrated instruments. Weeks earlier, he had warned Earl the system could fail: condensation, heat loss through the metal, structural risk. None of it had appeared, but Pollard didn't deal in impressions or anecdotes. "I want to take readings," he said as he stepped out of the vehicle. "Go ahead," Earl replied evenly. Pollard planted the outdoor thermometer in the snow. It read -35°F. Then he passed through the small double-door vestibule Earl had built like an airlock. The contrast was immediate. Not a blast of heat, but the unmistakable sensation of being in a human space, not a hostile one. Pollard placed his thermometer in the center of the cabin. He waited, wrote it down, moved to one corner, then another, measured again. 64. He murmured, staring at the instrument as if expecting it to correct itself. He repeated the process for 20 minutes. Near the floor. Near the ceiling. Along the north wall. Far from the stove. The coldest point read 58. The warmest, 68. The average was undeniable. 63 degrees, he said finally, under these exterior conditions. He didn't look up right away. He wrote carefully in his notebook, then took a slow breath. "I was wrong," he admitted without drama. "Completely." That sentence traveled through the valley faster than any rumor, because it didn't come from a curious neighbor, but from the technical authority everyone respected, even when they disagreed with him. Pollard didn't leave immediately. He wanted to understand. Earl led him into the passageway between the cabin and the steel arch. The air there was cold, but not biting. There were no drafts. No visible moisture. The wood was dry. "The air doesn't move," Earl explained. "And still air doesn't steal heat." He didn't speak like a professor. He spoke like someone who had spent sleepless nights listening to his daughters shiver. In the days that followed, the comparisons became unavoidable. The Colby family, 2 miles south, had burned nearly 2 cords of firewood in December just to keep an average indoor temperature of 42 degrees. They all slept in a single room. Pipes froze even with the fire burning. Earl, during that same period, had used less than 1 full cord and lived at over 60 degrees. The difference wasn't small. It was humiliating to the valley's certainties. The final blow came when William, Earl's brother, decided to bring his own records to the table. He had been one of the harshest critics. His cabin in Whitefish was considered exemplary: professional construction, top-grade materials. Even so, in January he was burning nearly 2 cords a month to maintain an average of 48 degrees. He visited Earl on January 10th. He walked in wearing his coat. 5 minutes later, he hung it on a hook. "That can't be," he said, more to himself than to his brother. Earl showed him the records, dates, quantities, temperatures. No tricks. No exaggeration. William did the math in silence, moving his lips. "You're using less than half the firewood," he finally said, "and you're 20 degrees warmer." Earl nodded. "More like 25 when the wind's strong," he corrected. William sat down. Watched his nieces playing on the floor without jackets. Swallowed hard. "This isn't a minor improvement," he admitted. "This is a different category." And that was what unsettled everyone the most. This wasn't about optimizing a traditional cabin. It was about changing the logic entirely. For generations, the valley had fought winter with more wood, more fire, more sacrifice. No one had seriously considered stopping the enemy before it touched the house. The numbers didn't lie. And in a winter that was breaking records, numbers carried more weight than opinion. By mid-January, the question was no longer whether Earl's system worked. The question was far more dangerous to many men's pride. Why hadn't any of them thought of it first? The answer was uncomfortable. They had confused tradition with truth. Cold had always been accepted as inevitable, not as a problem that could be solved. That winter, inside the metal-wrapped cabin, more than heat was being retained. An old certainty was melting. The change didn't arrive with applause or speeches. It arrived quietly, the way real transformations almost always do on the frontier. One man watching another. A question asked in a low voice. A notebook pulled from a pocket inside a warm kitchen while the wind howled outside. By mid-January 1948, Earl Hutchins's cabin stopped being a curiosity and became a reference point. Men no longer rode past just to laugh. They came to look closely. They measured with their eyes, counted steps, touched the wood, listened. Earl didn't charge. He didn't advertise visits. He didn't present himself as an expert. He simply opened the door. "See for yourself," he said. The first person to copy the idea wasn't a builder or an engineer. It was a desperate man. Vernon Ehart lived 4 miles northwest, in a cabin exposed directly to mountain winds. By January, his woodpile was already half gone. He wouldn't make it to March. There was no time for pride. Vernon didn't have access to a steel arch, but he understood the essential idea: stop the wind and create still air. In 4 days, he built a second wall inside his cabin using thin pine strips, scrap lumber, and leftover boards. He left a 16-inch gap between the new wall and the original. He didn't fill it completely, just loose straw to block drafts. He cut small vents at the top and bottom. The result was immediate. His firewood use dropped nearly 40%. The indoor temperature rose 12 degrees. It wasn't Earl's miracle, but it was enough to survive. The news traveled fast. By the end of January, 2 more families had tried variations. One stretched heavy canvas over an exterior frame. Another enclosed only the west and south sides of their cabin, the ones punished most by wind. Both saw clear improvements. These weren't theories. They were results. The county agent, Pollard, the same man who had doubted the system, began taking more formal notes. He made no public announcements. He simply stopped warning against the idea. In private, he started explaining it to those who asked. "The principle is sound," he said. "Still air and eliminated wind. That's enough." When the cold finally loosened its grip in February, the conversation had already shifted. It was no longer about whether the system worked, but how to do it better. People talked about air gap width, ventilation, available materials. Men who had laughed months earlier now discussed technical details with near reverence. In spring, with time and daylight on their side, more careful constructions began. The military depot in Great Falls still had steel arches available. 7 families bought units with a clear purpose: build cabins inside external protection. Others couldn't afford the metal and adapted barns, sheds, extended roofs. Every solution was different, but all shared the same logic. By the summer of 1948, the valley's landscape had changed subtly, not dramatically. There was no sharp line between old and new. But here and there, double structures appeared. Shadows beneath extended roofs. Air corridors where there had once been only wind. Calvin Drecker, the man who had once called it a metal coffin, became one of its most practical defenders. He didn't give speeches. He just said, "If you stop the wind, you stop the cold." And people listened, because Calvin didn't speak in abstractions. He spoke like someone who had seen the numbers and compared them. What stood out most wasn't the technology. It was the human effect. That winter, for the first time in decades, some families stopped sleeping in shifts just to feed the fire. Children studied without gloves. Women cooked without layers of clothing piled on their backs. Winter stopped being a constant battle and became what it had always been meant to be: a hard season, but a manageable one. No one talked about degrees or percentages when they sat down at a warm table. They talked about rest, about normalcy, About dignity. Earl watched it all with calm distance. He never took credit. When people asked why it worked, he repeated the same thing. The wind is the problem. Stop it and the heat stays. Nothing more than that. By the winter of 1948 to 1949, nearly 20 cabins within a 50-mile radius had implemented some form of double wall or external wrap. Not all achieved the same results, but none went back. The mockery had disappeared, not because people apologized, but because it was no longer necessary. On the frontier, reason isn't defended with words. It's proven through survival. And Earl Hutchins, without intending to, had changed the way an entire valley faced the cold. Not with speeches. Not with tradition. But with something far more powerful, a winter lived without fear. The winter of 1947 to 1948 didn't end abruptly. It withdrew slowly, like a tired animal, leaving behind split logs, wood piles reduced to ash, and a different kind of silence in the valley. It wasn't the silence of exhaustion. It was the silence of reflection. When temperatures finally rose above zero consistently, people began to look back, not at stories, but at data. Cords of firewood burned. Nights slept. Children who had been sick, or hadn't. The comparisons were unavoidable. In most traditional cabins, firewood consumption had exceeded 2 cords per month during the worst of the cold. In some cases, nearly 3. Even then, indoor temperatures rarely climbed above the low 40s. Winter had been a daily fight, a string of short nights and fires watched with fear. In Earl Hutchins's cabin, the numbers told a different story. Over the same period, total consumption never reached a full cord per month. The average indoor temperature held steady around 63 degrees, even on the harshest nights. In simple terms, the difference was roughly 25 degrees compared to many other homes in the valley. 25 degrees wasn't a luxury. It was the line between survival and well-being. William Hutchins, the brother who had once doubted, was among the first to admit it, though in his own way. He didn't apologize. There was no need. He simply returned to Whitefish and began modifying his own cabin in the spring. He added a partial external wrap on the side most exposed to wind. The following winter, he burned less firewood than ever before. Others followed. By 1949, the concept was no longer strange. People spoke of the Hutchins method, or simply the wind trick, not as a curiosity but as another practical tool, no different from a solid foundation or a steep roof. Agent Pollard published a brief technical note in the Regional Agricultural Bulletin. He avoided naming individuals. He described the principle, the observed results, and the extreme conditions under which it had been tested. That was enough for the idea to cross borders. Variations appeared in Idaho, Wyoming, even parts of Alaska, where surplus military materials were accessible. Not everyone used metal. Some used wood. Others used canvas. Some repurposed barns or sheds. But the principle remained intact. Eliminate wind, create still air, let physics do the rest. Most remarkable of all, the idea didn't replace the traditional log cabin. It completed it. No one rejected logs, wood, or the old ways of building. They simply added a layer of intelligence to what had always been brute force. Earl never sought recognition. He didn't patent anything. He didn't give lectures. He didn't travel to demonstrate his system. He kept living in his warm cabin, cutting firewood, raising his daughters, answering questions when someone approached with respect. Margaret poured coffee. Earl explained ventilation, air gaps, the importance of preventing drafts. They walked through the passageway between cabin and metal. They touched dry wood. They saw no frost, no moisture, no decay. Over time, the cabin became a quiet reference, not a monument, but proof. In 1962, when Ruth and Clara left to attend school, the family moved into town. The cabin remained. The steel arch stood firm. The airspace stayed dry. The system worked exactly as it had the first winter everyone had laughed. Decades later, on January nights when the wind howled through the mountains and the mercury plunged, other families sat comfortably in double-walled homes, perhaps unaware of where the idea had come from. But the idea was there, integrated, normalized. That is what distinguishes truly intelligent solutions. They don't need to be remembered. They only need to work. The men who had mocked it lived long enough to see their grandchildren build differently. Some admitted they'd been wrong. Most simply adopted the change in silence, as the frontier dictates. Because in places where cold can kill, tradition doesn't have the final word. What works does. And that steel arch dragged down a frozen trail in November 1947 had proven something essential, that the enemy was never winter itself, but the way it was allowed inside. Earl Hutchins didn't defeat the cold with more fire. He defeated it with less loss. And that was the warmth that endured.